Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today we are discussing with Richard Samuelson the principles of American citizenship and immigration. Professor Richard Samuelson is an associate professor of history at California State University, San Bernardino. The occasion of this conversation is an essay that he recently published in the journal American Citizens and Statesmen called Exceptionalism and Citizenship. A modified version of that essay appears in the current Claremont Review of Books called The Genius of American Citizenship. Richard, glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this essay argues that America is an exceptional nation, and that this is particularly evident with regard to immigration and citizenship. How so?
Well, most nations in history are not quite so good, or good at all, at merging immigrants into the nation as America has been. You can be a citizen of France, or Spain, or pick a nation around the world, Japan or Nigeria. Your family can be officially citizens for a century, but you're still not considered to be Japanese or French or Russian, pick one. Whereas in America, you tend to be considered an American quickly enough, pretty much the day you become a citizen. If you give you an example, which I mentioned in my piece, I don't know if I need to pick on John Pocock, the distinguished historian, but he casually refers to Sir Louis Namur as a foreigner. Namur was born in Poland, but he moved to England when he was young. He served in the British Army in World War I, became a very distinguished British historian, and was knighted, and he's still a foreigner. Such a career in the United States would render someone an American, and that's the difference. That is one key thing that sets American nationality apart from other nationalities that have been known in history.
Let me ask you, just thinking about your essay, you note that xenophobia, which is something with regard to immigration that we hear a lot of, is common throughout human history. Obviously, for there to be an in-group, there have to be out-groups. But yet you note this isn't really what's at stake. I mean, we have throughout American history with regards to large periods of immigration, kind of these outbursts and rejections. But this notion of volitional citizenship, which you've been talking about, seems to emerge and be powerful and triumphant overall in immigration history within America. So I guess that kind of begs the question, though. Now we seem hopelessly confused. And when I read your essay, it seems very clear to me the principles you articulate, and it even seems that a large cross-section of Americans would agree with them. And yet we are in the middle of, I guess it seems we've been doing this for a very long time now, these embittered debates over immigration reform efforts. So what do you think is going wrong?
Well, the couple things going on. One is, anytime, I think in any country out in history, maybe it's not a universal rule, but it tends to be, it's very rare when there is not an uproar when there's mass immigration. There tends to be, if there's sustained mass immigration for decade after decade, the natives will be upset about all these newcomers. Right, one thing is, Jefferson said in Notes on the State of Virginia about immigrants, as I pointed out in the essay, right? When people come from somewhere else, they won't know American principles, and if they come from a tyranny or perhaps simply a monarchy, it is unlikely they will stop at temperate liberty. They'll move all the way from one extreme to another, perhaps. It's very hard, just culturally, to assimilate people towards your understanding of liberty. Jefferson, of course, assuming the American version would be the best. And so that's one element of it. The second is, I think, in the 20th century, the current immigration wave is different partly because it's from right next door, which means people can go back and forth in a way that wasn't really possible. Also, that wasn't really possible before you had modern transportation technology. But there's also, I think, a difference in the character of the American nation. with the rise of the megastate, to use a term, I think, and some other decisions, which we'll get to, I think, that has changed the nature of American nationhood. Now, the American state, people would say, in the 19th century we didn't have a nation in the classic sense of a nation, that is, a cultural unit, right? We're not a cultural unit, we're really a political unit as a nation, and we didn't really have a state in the German sense of a Staat, a Marktstaat, a powerful central state, right? What we had is a very loose central government, where it didn't matter whatsoever that the British burned Washington. The government kept functioning. Right? There wasn't so much going on there. That's no longer true, by the way. That I think if Washington went down, it would fundamentally challenge America the way having the Capitol burned in the War of 1812 didn't. And that's relevant, I think, because of this notion of volitional citizenship and a political citizenship is connected historically and I think logically with the kind of government America had in previous ages before the rise of the modern comprehensive administrative state. To put this in another way, one debate of the early republic, or even of the founding period, was about the size of the republic. Classically, republics were small. There was a public, and there can only be a public when you really have a community that knows each other. But as Madison pointed out famously in Federalist 10, those are not known for lasting a long time, and they are known for their divisions, for the triumph of factions. He suggested famously, extend the sphere, and you'll have the Republican remedy for the vices of Republican government. You will not have a faction triumphing. That tends to go along with a nation where the central government doesn't do quite so much. In other words, a cultural nationalism tends to go along with an expansive state that is involved in all those things those cultures are involved with, whereas a merely political nationalism must be somewhat separate from culture and therefore must not be involved in all the aspects of culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess a couple of things that I'm thinking of as I listen to your answer here. And one thing is the notion of, as you mentioned, Jefferson, immigrants come to America, but without necessarily understanding or kind of having it deeply in their bones, these certain principles of American constitutionalism, or maybe really understanding, say, the Declaration of Independence and what that suggests if you fit it with Republican constitutionalism. And so these things have to be taught and learned and picked up along the way and made a part of one's political practice. And of course, I think it's common in conservative discussions of immigration to say, well, we just don't have that anymore. Or there's the elites who are in charge of various positions of leadership, education, universities, the government, bureaucracy. We have a racial preferences regime, all of this, and as you allude to later parts of the essay, putting Americans into blocks, et cetera. So that's clearly one problem. It seems also, in thinking about the cultural nationalism, the election that you make to become an American also delinks the culture, but also delinks the religion as well. And so maybe that's another way to think about why religion is still so thick in American life. It's because it's not actually tied to a culture or nationality, the way, say, Christianity, you have French Christianity or German or Italian or something like that, but it's actually delinked from it. And so it actually becomes something a more purer practice. But that is all kind of, as you're suggesting, all of this is kind of thrown into question by current practices.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You go back, and you've heard this treaty quoted often enough, one of the early American treaties with one of the Barbary states in northern Africa refers to the United States, at least in the version that America has, not actually, I think, the version that's over there, as a Christian nation. The United States has no sense of Christian nation, but what does that mean? Right? Obviously, if nation is based on culture, we're a Christian nation. That's our heritage, right? Mm-hmm. It's most Americans have been Christian. Our values often come from Christianity. Something like our judicial oath, which says, right, well, it says favor neither. It doesn't say quite favor neither the poor nor the rich, but it uses phrases almost exactly that phrase. I assume that comes from common law, but that's ultimately traceable to Leviticus. And the phrase just before that, by the way, is the injunction to welcome the stranger into your midst, and have one law for you and the stranger. Right? So that is all part of our heritage. But if that is true and we're not a Christian nation, what it means is that our nationalism is not a cultural nationalism. And that's the second part. Then what kind of government do you have to go along with that? The other thing you mentioned is, right, our current state, our current official class and our education establishment. I don't know if it's just the racial preference and all that. I don't think that's real central to it. Maybe it is a certain way. But the rise of multiculturalism, treating people as part of cultural groups or ethnic groups or racial groups, as opposed to treating people as American citizens. If I remember correctly, when he was nominated to the court, some of the people talking about Justice Souter's record, they mentioned that they were supposed to fill in a census form for the United States government for New Hampshire, and it was supposed to say how many citizens they had of each ethnic group. And he just put down, I do not know what the number was, 985,000 Americans, period. And it was litigated and they lost. You weren't just allowed to classify people as simply Americans from the census. And of course the census exists legally, officially, so we can have official districts of the same size, and you don't get rotten boroughs in America. The purpose of the census legally is not for the social scientists to have data.
Yeah.
And that shows how we have changed our understanding of how the government thinks we're supposed to relate to the state. We're supposed to be, we are classified, we are thought of as people who carry ethnic identities and other sub-identities, not simply as individual Americans, and we relate to the government on that basis. And that's what's taught in our schools also.
Yeah.
By the way, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting. Interesting part of your essay, I think continuing along here, is America's welcoming of Jewish immigrants, which, given the history of the Jewish people, particularly in Europe, is remarkable. And you note this, and you quote George Washington's famous letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, and I wanted to just read it because I think it's wonderful. Quote, "Happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support." End quote. And then you note a lot of different ways in which Jewish immigration has interacted in America, has worked, and also you have a nice quote from Calvin Coolidge in this regard. That in itself is instructive of the volitional citizenship and the willingness to welcome a group that has struggled so much.
Right. I mean, Jewish history since the Roman time of shortly after the Roman Empire became the Roman Empire has been one of wandering from place to place to find countries that would have essentially this people resident in their country. And in America, they found we have a place that doesn't care that people are Jewish. Go ahead, worship that way. Don't eat pork.
Yeah.
Butcher your animals a particular way. Go ahead, we don't care. Just pay your taxes. If there's a war, serve in the army, right? Some of the early financiers of the revolution were Jews, if I remember correctly. Be good citizens, and go ahead, we don't care, right? That's historically very, very rare for people not to care. As a Jewish person, this has been a bit of an identity crisis for Jews, I think, historically, but that's another story. But I think it says something about America it's such a strange nation that you have a people come who is a people, not just a religious group. And they say, go ahead, do what you want. Just don't bother, follow the laws, be good citizens. That's only possible, by the way, when the law doesn't regulate all that much. The law doesn't care how you butcher your animals. You're allowed to make accommodations to worship on Saturday rather than Sunday, though historically that actually has caused some conflicts every now and then, but not too many. Right? Remember the 19th century, you had communities that were created where people banned marriage, the perfectionist
that's right.
communities.
The Shakers.
Right. There were, well, not just that, there was the Shakers, where everyone's celibate, but then there was it was a John Humphrey Noyes, where there was complex marriage, everybody was married to everyone else, and this was a real scandal at the time. But it happened.
Yeah.
So in other words, there was this great openness in America, and there has been historically, to just living however you want, as long as you follow the laws. But the laws, in order for that to be possible, simply can't cut that deeply into your life.
Let me think. Thinking about kind of what you're articulating, and the current situation, and let's just assume arguendo that we are in a lot of trouble in thinking about American immigration, or say a lot of trouble. We're confused, and so we have we can say there's a confusion on the right, there's a confusion on the left, in contrasting ways. One thing that seems, I don't even know if this is really that argumentative at this point, but I think it seems obvious that you have a left that wants to use immigration as a way to bring in a increased clientele for the federal government, if not for the state governments, and to actually augment their power at the voting booth, at least until a couple of generations could go by, and let's say that group actually no longer really identifies with the Democratic Party and their brand of politics. In that light, and in the light of we really don't seem to have the institutions actively inculcating American citizenship, as you've addressed it, would it be prudential to just say minimal immigration for now, or hold the line, or something along those lines? I was just curious to get your response on kind of a prudential approach to this.
Right. Well, there's an interesting problem is historically, right? We have waves of immigration that cascade and then slow down.
Yeah.
And this one the current wave keeps waving, right? It seemed to have slowed down, and now it seems to pick up again with the latest discussion of immigration reform, which suggests that in the policy matter, it might be, if there actually is a fence put in, so we can somehow we'll kind of accept all the immigrants here now, but there'll be no new immigration. That would end things where people come. But if there's expectation of future amnesty, that encourages people to come over. But that's a separate issue for you discussing. I don't know. I'm sure there are people in the Democratic Party who are that cynical, but I think the reason why there's so much support for immigration reform is precisely for welcoming immigrants, is because we're so proud of our history as Americans for welcoming immigrants. And the irony is, I think, as I've argued in the essay, that we've been welcoming precisely because we have not been a multicultural nation, where people relate to the government through their culture. They relate to the government as individuals. And I think it's a very interesting question whether we will be able to assimilate American citizens from this wave of immigration if we don't actually believe that American culture is good and believe people should assimilate towards it, and then do not believe in multiculturalism as our public policy and our public, maybe religion is the right term for it, something like that, our values, right? But there's also something which I talk about in the essay. I talk about the question of birthright citizenship, which I think you probably want me to discuss a little bit.
Yeah. No, I was gonna. Yeah, definitely. But keep going.
And that's the interesting question, right? That geographic citizenship, or citizenship based on soil, to be a little polemical about it, maybe, is an interesting phenomenon. Historically, that's what the king had. If you were born on English soil, the king owned you. You couldn't cease being his subject without his consent. You couldn't leave England without his consent. That's the way it worked, right? And that was not necessarily the way Americans always saw it. There's much conflict about this. It's unclear what we meant, what the actual doctrine was. In particularly, read when we talk about a natural-born citizen in the founding period, they could be talking about common law, which would mean natural-born, born on the king's soil. But there's also, they might have been repudiating that. After all, the king said they couldn't cease being British subjects without his consent. And that's precisely what they were arguing over with the Declaration of Independence. George Washington, as I mentioned in the essay, he quotes, I quote his proclamation to Loyalists. Look, we understand you're allowed to choose not to be Americans. We don't like it, but you're allowed to choose. Go ahead, take your property with you. The king didn't see it that way, right? The king would say, no, you can't leave. And that's a difference, a very important difference, right? Citizenship by choice goes both ways. The right to cease being American is connected to the right to choose being American. But citizenship based on location and birth is not choice. That's accident of birth making you a citizen. And that's having a very important effect on our current debate. because so many of the immigration, of the current immigrants, and the current wave of immigration, are chain migration, part of a chain migration, where people will have a child here, and then the child's an American citizen. It's not fair to kick their parents out, which could be an interesting question. If they chose to have their child here, well, they're the people responsible, but that's a separate moral question. But that's based on the phenomenon of saying citizenship is fundamentally based on where you are when you happen to be born. And right now you have a case, there's some suggestion that the mayor of London, whose descended from a couple English kings, I think George III and one of the Jameses, a couple of the Jameses probably, his parents happened to be living in New York when he was born. And there's some discussion of whether the IRS should send him a tax return saying you're an American citizen, you should pay up unless you can prove otherwise. That's taking us back to the notion that your land is not presumptively yours, your citizenship is not presumptively based on choice, and in fact, you belong to the government. Your rights come from the government. You don't have them by nature, then you agree to submit to government for some protection of those rights. It's a very different notion of nationality. So it's an open question, I think, whether geographic citizenship was the doctrine of the founding. And then in 1898, in the case of U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark, there was a child of Chinese laborers who went back to China and was not allowed back in, and the court, in a 7-2 decision, decided he was born here, therefore he's an American citizen. The minority, interestingly, was Chief Justice Fuller, who was joined by Harlan, and this is 2 years after Justice Harlan's famous dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. In other words, roughly the same majority that gave us separate but equal also gave us birthright citizenship, or citizenship based on soil, as opposed to citizenship based on the principles of compact, and perhaps law of nations theory in the 18th century, to Emmerich Vattel instead of common law. Vattel talks about natural born being according to the principles of nature. And the principles of nature, if you believe that government based on consent is natural, then the principles of nature would be citizenship based on consent of you or your parents. So if your parents are citizens, you would be a citizen wherever you are. And the first bill that talks about nationalization in the 1790s actually says people born to American parents abroad are natural-born citizens. Although the 1795 bill doesn't mention that. It's unclear if it was repealed or simply not mentioned. So it's an interesting question. This is all open for discussion. But what does change, when you have a mass wave of immigration from people who are just across the border, and you say wherever the person is, that determines whether they're an American citizen. So a woman is in the process of giving birth, and she's in the process of coming across the American border. If she makes it across in time, her child's American. If she doesn't make it across in time, her child's not American. This seems rather strange. And interestingly, if there's actually some discussion of something like this in John Adams' legal notes, I do a lot of work on John Adams, and he's discussing a hypothetical case. In New England, you were responsible for providing food, shelter, clothing, etc., for people born in your town. That's how charity was done. And you would warn someone out from your town so they didn't stick around, because once they gained residence, you were responsible for them. He says, suppose a woman who was with child sneaks in the middle of the night to your town and has a child there. Are you responsible for him? He says, no, of course that case wouldn't apply. It's not straightforward and legal and up and up. That might have interesting implications for how we would reason about the cases of immigrants who come here without our consent. The question there is whether someone can choose to make their child an American citizen without the consent of the current American citizens, right? Do we current citizens have a role to play in deciding who joins us as part of this social compact? And current court doctrine says we do not. But on the other hand, it's unclear. It's not necessarily true. The majority opinion applies to all cases. The majority opinion applied to the child of immigrants who had permanent legal status. It has not, as far as I know, been litigated, the question of somebody who is here on a tourist visa and has a kid, or someone who's here without any visa, i.e. illegally.
Yeah, it's interesting in thinking about elective choice and consent, but the duties that puts upon the immigrant coming to America, and the way those have been, in many respects, and I'm not making light of the humanitarian situation, but openly flouted by millions in the current situation. in our current immigration situation with the illegal population rising and coming into a country without papers or without any sort of clear documentation or pass is, to start on bad faith from the beginning, it seems.
Or if you're going to be a government of laws, not of men,
Yeah.
to quote John Adams' description of a republic, right? Then presumably you should be joining the nation legally to be part of the laws above everybody. What's interesting, a lot of people don't see it that way, and somehow that's related to all the changes we've seen in American life, I think, in the past century. We're not a nation of laws in the same way as we used to be. Partly because we don't relate to the government as individuals who are all together under law. We relate to the government as groups who get special dispensations based upon what group we are, or frankly businesses too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
When government doesn't do many things, the government doesn't do favors to many. It does favors to some businesses, but not to many. When government's as big as it is now, every business has to watch out for the government, has to be careful what it gets, what it doesn't get. And so it just changes the way we relate to the government and the way we understand law. Law isn't written. Heck, the other thing is laws are no longer bills passed by the legislature. The legislature passes kind of general grants, solve this problem, and then the administrative bureaucracy writes thousands of pages of regulations from each of those grants. To me, that's law. They're writing the legal code. And additionally, from an Adamsian perspective, John Adams, kind of like the father in the movie The Big Fat Greek Wedding, who could see a Greek root for every word. John Adams looks at any society and finds the aristocracy, right? Yeah. The aristocrats were those who have more than the average of power. Well, who's writing our legal code? People who have a credential and have jobs for life. This is an aristocracy. We have an elite from good schools, hopefully, rather than people from bad schools, who are intelligent, they have a credential, and then they have jobs for life. And often they pass these jobs on to their children. I've read one or two places. Maybe I'm not sure how true that is. But the people who are in the bureaucracy writing a legal code, they have lifetime jobs, and then they pass these jobs on to their children. That looks like aristocracy to me, even in a more conventional sense of the term. So we're moving away from a regime in which we, the people, get to choose how our laws are made and what they are.
No, I mean, and that kind of brings up several interesting questions, I think. I mean, you mentioned children. So if what a lot of people are writing about now, Charles Murray maybe most prominently, with the idea of an elite and coming together through assortative marriage, assortative mating, I think is the term he uses. Others have used the term. And then you have that transferred up, that the social capital, their IQ, et cetera, all forming this elite who will, as it were, seem to revolve around large businesses into Washington, back into regulated businesses, et cetera. And that's kind of a ruling class, as people have called it. But also that brings up, I think, another question with regard to immigration, and that is this notion that's out there. Some data behind it, largely impressionistically, I think, that the middle class is shrinking. And that largely what we're getting is a large working class, a poor class, and then you've got, say, a top 10%, and then of course we've got the 1% we hear so much about. Now, but what does that do for immigration? Because that would seem to suggest the rungs on the ladder are disappearing. But if that's true, then what do you get with a continued flow of immigration, particularly low-skilled immigration, if you don't adjust your policy to, say, something like Canada or Australia have, which seems to give more points and more favorability to high-skilled, high-capital individuals?
Yeah, that's certainly true, right? Of course, that does, even high-skilled immigration will drive down the wages of that part of the engineering class, but that's a different problem than if you bring in more people who have no job skills and have to work at manual labor. And also, it's related to our schools are not as good as they used to be, so you might not be as good at raising people from the immigrant groups in order to move them into different classes. Though maybe we're starting to address that question. I don't know enough about the schools to say that. But it's a very interesting question. Historically, I think the American nationalism not being cultural nationalism means we do believe in assimilating immigrants. We do believe in welcoming them here, right? And then the question is, it's a buyer's market. If a lot of people want to come to America, we can choose who we want first and take them first. So you focus on high-skilled immigrants first, and then low-skilled immigrants last, if you can do that. Though there's also the American tradition of compassion that has a lot of purchase in American life. But I do think what's interesting is this compassion has, ironically, in some ways undermined the values that have made it possible to assimilate immigrants. Precisely because when it used to be, if you wanted to be an immigrant, you had to certify they would not be a public charge.
That's right.
If I understand the law correctly.
No, that's
no
right.
longer true. Why is that? Because you want to bring people who are going to make positive contributions. If you read some of the letters, which I looked at a long time ago, I think this might have been the refugees, the Jewish refugees who wanted to come in. Remember, immigration was cut down in the 1920s, way back, and wanted to flee Europe. And they would say, we're not going to become public charges, right? And people in the Jewish community would certify for that. So you do have some group bringing their own people over. But that was a selling point, right? And now that's not the way we see it. It's seen as wrong to mention that by a significant portion of our culture. Of course, this has to do with kind of the impact of democratization. Democratization in the sense of perhaps another John Adams bit he always harps on, Book 8 of Plato's Republic. In a democracy, all notions of inequality become anathema to you, the concept of it. So the notion it is unfair that some people are born into a fortunate situation and some are not, either nationwide in terms of intellect, in terms of health, all these things. And that's related as well. We have trouble making these distinctions. We have trouble saying we want to help America succeed. We want to take the smartest, most capable, most ambitious immigrants first because they will do the most to make America continue to be America in the long term. I think that's a very important point. We're uncomfortable talking that way about that, precisely because we don't want people to think we're bigoted and don't want people from a different culture coming here. But that's not necessarily what's really going on. It's not unreasonable to say, we'll take engineers from wherever, or more educated people from wherever, but then you're discriminating against the poor, I suppose.
Yeah.
On the other hand, some of this is just...
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Richard. I was just going to, thinking about, you use the term compassion, and thinking Angela Codavilla has written on the website about that notion of compassion, but it was a bargain that the immigrant came and would work, largely in a thankless job or a low-level job, but it would be work. It would be grinding work, and that would be your contribution, and who knows what would happen after you or what would happen for your children. Hopefully it would be better. But of course that compassion in that sense is, it seems unremarkable for me to say, seems undermined now and we've touched on a lot in this interview. Also, you were mentioning the administrative state and the problem of law that it creates, or the notion of law and liberty created by it. And even in the immigration reform bill, of course I haven't read it. I've read a lot about it. Over 1,000 pages.
I don't think anybody will read the whole thing.
Over 1,000 pages. Does nothing to address a lot of the concerns that we've raised. And we're reasonable guys, right? And in many respects, it actually creates further bureaucracies to manage the immigrants that it contemplates bringing over, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a compounding of problems, it seems. And plus it doubles down on, I think, a lot of just wrong-headed notions that are in immigration. And in particular, it does seem that there's all the other concern about the border security as well, But of course, that really takes care of itself if you've got a lot of the principles we're talking about in line and fastened down.
Yeah, it's true, right? If you say people have to come here legally, if we're not so squeamish about, look, we have laws. We believe in welcoming immigrants, but we also believe in respecting the law. And if you didn't follow the law, there has to be a serious penalty, or you should have for doing that. There's a lot of people who don't see it that way. But getting the other side, the administrative state, you mentioned the hiring of bureaucrats. Partly what's going on, I think, is you have this rise of this new professional class, partly that I think related to what Charles Murray talks about, the asort of mating. People need jobs. And as America becomes less entrepreneurial, because I think there are more regulations, there's less opportunity simply to go out and do things. In my class, I've just been discussing Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. He helped create a fire company, Franklin Stove, street lighting, street cleaning, a night watch, voluntary military, American Philosophical Society, etc., right, the lightning rod. How did he do all this? Well, no one told him he couldn't. He didn't have to ask the government whether he needed permission to create the Franklin stove or to even create a night watch or street sweeping. How does he say lighting happened in Philadelphia? It wasn't him. It was actually one of his neighbors just put a light outside his door. And see, isn't this good? Oh, let's do the same thing. And the people on the street paid for the lamps. Right? There was this tremendous openness because there was no law saying you have to check with the government to see whether you're allowed to make that improvement or even to make that change or try that experiment. And the current generation, because it's so much harder to do that, and also because there's a little conservatism, small c, people are afraid they're going to lose what they have. They want jobs in the administrative bureaucracy, more and more do, either of the bureaucratic side of large corporations or of the government. So this bill provides lots of jobs. And, of course, they're another Adamsian concept. People want to feel good about themselves. He calls it the spectrum of Rogendo. People want to be seen in action, to draw love to themselves. His version, his response to the people who believe love is the answer to the problems. No, love is what causes competition. I want to be loved more than him, so I will kill him for that reason. But where does paternalism come from? They will love me because I'm taking care of them. The American Revolution, at its best, was a revolution against paternalism. But that implies a revolution against a state that takes care of us. It's a state where we're fundamentally responsible for ourselves. And this attitude is changing. I heard recently, maybe this is not true. I read somewhere recently, in the Virginia election, the people around Northern Virginia who work in the government bureaucracy and in the lobbyist groups and elsewhere, right? To many Americans, how did soon-to-be Governor McAuliffe make his money? Through his connections.
Yes.
And some of those businesses turned very sour. Most Americans say, well, that's not right. He used connections to make money. He didn't actually make anything or do something. What does the elite around Washington think? Good for him. That's all anyone does. Yeah. Right? If that's how you see things, you're going to see people as part of groups. You're going to see the scramble for the greasy pole, not to say, oh, what can I create that people will pay me for? It's how can I get some of the resources that will be distributed in this system that's already been gamed. So that relates us back to, I think is one of the more interesting things in the essay, maybe I'm wrong about this, is the discussion of Federalist 10, the extended sphere. There's a reading of that Madison wanted pluralism. That is to say, how do you get rid of the problem of faction? You have a large republic, and therefore you don't have majority faction because you have no majority. So then people say, though, there are lots of different smaller factions that perhaps could serve us. Madison didn't see it that way. What Madison wanted is no one that wasn't supporting the public interest, no faction could control the majority. But what about a coalition of 35% here, 13% there, and 6% there, and all of a sudden you have three factions that together make a majority, and they pass policies. Well, they're going to do it to help each group, not the common good. That's an obvious problem with the extended sphere. And I think that's why Jefferson and Madison and others were opposed to what we would call big government, even the very, very small version of it. They were opposed to building roads and canals even, right? John C. Calhoun introduced the bonus bill to use surplus from sale of lands, I believe, to build roads and canals. And Madison vetoes it at the end of his presidency, saying we don't have constitutional authority for this. Maybe we should get an amendment, he suggests. And if that's just putting it off or because he believed it, it's an open question. But he thinks the fewer things government does, the harder it is to assemble majority faction. The more likely it is government relates to people as citizens and simply pursues the common good. Or to put it another way, in a small republic, the government does everything. The government tells you essentially gives everything from building codes, health, safety, morals, the classic police power, except they're up through foreign policy. In a large republic, the only thing we do in common is the very basics, and maybe at a very local level, you take care of the police power. Even Hamilton said the police power is local. Defending the national bank is constitutional. He says we can create a corporation in order to have a national bank because the bank fulfills other constitutional duties. We cannot create a corporation to regulate the police, i.e. the police power, health, safety, morals of Philadelphia, because the federal government does not have that authority. Our current government is much more nationalistic than even Hamilton allowed.
Yeah. Yeah, I was getting, your point about Terry McAuliffe and the term crony capitalism. It really harkens to also this idea, and I think that's what you're alluding to. Leo Strauss's idea of the regime, and laws being so comprehensive that they reach in and they don't just they shape human behavior, but they actually fundamentally change how we think of ourselves in relationship to the government and how we're going to act and interact with our neighbors, and the crony capitalism would be a part of that, and the entrepreneurial behavior really changes, and that's what you're saying, and that's certainly of note, and maybe we can end. I like to end on hopefully a positive note. I don't know that there's a lot of positivity here, other than to suggest that our immigration situation, there is still a lot of empirical evidence when you look at surveys of recent immigrants, current immigrants, that they do acclimate to a lot of American ideals and believe in them, want to take on the English language, things like that. And I think as much as we can look, and there's a lot of evidence with respect to, let's say, the broad Hispanic immigration of recent, the last 2 decades, that maybe they do favor larger government than other American citizens. But yet there's also, as has been noted, a tremendous work ethic as well there. And so there are things that can build on, that we can build on and applying and thinking about your principles.
So I think that's all true. I remember hearing someone who spent a lot of time in Iraq and talking to some of the Iraqis who got to know the American soldiers. And so what's your reaction? He says, you're much better than your culture. That is the impression people have abroad of us is from our pop culture. They think we're like the people in our movies who aren't necessarily the best people in the world. I think if people watched our movies from the 50s, they might have gotten a different impression. But I also wonder if that's also true, our notion that we focus, at least pessimists maybe, we focus on the side of American culture that we think is problematic. And there's still a lot of good going on. As John Adams wrote in Thoughts on Government in 1776, mentioning regime, the foundation of every government is some principle or passion in the minds of the people. We still believe in liberty and not just equality. And that notion of individual liberty, individual responsibility still resonates very much with America. It is not taught the degree it used to be, and it's not enshrined in our laws the degree it used to be. But I do think the tension we've been seeing in American politics lately might very well be because we think one way and our laws in some ways pull in another direction, and we're divided. Because our surveys, we support liberty, responsibility, etc., but then we support policies that seem to cut in a different direction, and we're still fighting that out. And I think that going forward, these ideas still resonate, and I still think there is very much grounds of hope. But the reason why people want to come here is there's opportunity. It's not just opportunity to be on the dole; it's opportunity to live a better life. Very few people, when asked, I think, who immigrate to America would say, what do you hope for the future? And they say, well, I just hope that the government will take care of me. I don't think that's what people want for their kids. But the other danger is, my understanding is some of the surveys of the children of immigrants who are socialized in America and through our schools, they lose some of the work ethic. They lose some of the values. And that's worrisome.
Yeah.
But I do think there is opportunity here because America is still America. And we can still believe in ourselves. Now, there's concern. On the one hand, take one example, which I put at the end of the essay. Right. Recently, we've seen campaigns to ban kosher slaughter or circumcision. Right, and it's been being done in Europe. Right, because they're seeing this is cruel to animals. The proper Jewish slaughter of animals. So it used to 1,000 years ago that was the most humane way to do it, but that's no longer true. Was the argument essentially? Circumcision is seen, why can you're mutilating the body of someone before they have choice to do so? You should do it at 18. If these are ancient rituals. To me, it seems presumptuous to say we're right and you're wrong. But be that as it may, if the government's regulating these things, it's going to be hard for observant Jews to stay in America. So too with the regulation of Catholic hospitals that provide abortion, sterilization, etc. On the other hand, these things haven't happened. There's been a backlash against that. It's still being litigated. So it's an interesting question. There are people who want to move in that direction, whose notion of toleration means if you have these ideas, they represent toleration. If you have those ideas, those are bigoted, you can't have them. But there's another side of the American mind that still has a fighting chance, and that is the one that believes in the classic ideas of liberty and responsibility. But I do think those ideas are very much bound up with the principles of the American Revolution. And those principles that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, most obviously. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that to preserve these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That we, the people, are in charge here. We create government to protect our individual rights. That still has a place in American society as long as America's America. And I think that's where opportunity is, because those are the only grounds, I think, upon which we can assimilate the millions who've been coming the last couple decades. And also, I think they're the only way America can move forward and still be a functioning nation. I don't think it's one thing to have a nation with a unified national government in France, which has a longer history of being unified and also has a particular culture and is smaller. But a big, diverse nation of 320 million is going to be very hard to run in a centralized, bureaucratic, administrative manner. So I think the default position, the position which gravity will tend us towards, it may very well be back towards the principles of the American Revolution that are still present in our regime. And the principles and passions in the mind of the American people will still orient us back towards liberty and responsibility.
Richard, excellent. Thank you so much for discussing principles of American citizenship and immigration. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes, and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org.